today is the first seminar of School of Architecture this semester. So actually, during the semester and this and next, so we try to organize some research seminar almost a bi-weekly basis to share the research faculty's research with the colleagues and also students. And also we try to invite some research champion from other program or some non-USS faculty so that we can learn from their research skill and from their expertise. And also we can find some opportunity to participate in those speakers' research. Actually, for the student especially, actually many faculty in our School of Architecture, we are developing many new research every year. So I think, yeah, I'd like to ask you to consider this seminar as an opportunity to be engaged with your professors or other faculties research project. So in the School of Architecture, as I said, we tried in this school year, we try to organize a research seminar bi-weekly basis so that we can share many innovative research and creative work, especially to the related to the built environment with all the student and faculty and also staff. So I think it is a good way to disseminate the faculty's cutting edge research and also the student research work. So for your information, so today we will have Professor Yolande Daniel as a first speaker, but within after 2 weeks, we will have another speaker. He's the David Schwartz. He's a vice principal in HLW. So he did some collaborative research with a USC student and also some student in Kang Medicine, and as well as his colleagues. So I think that is sponsored by multiple the industry partners, I think more than 20. So he shared the research work outcome that he did during this summer with based on our collaboration. Okay, okay, great. So let me introduce Professor Yolande Daniel. Yolande Daniel is a co-founding design principal of Studio SUMO in New York. She is a fellow of American Academy in Rome and recipient of Rome Prize in Architecture, as well as the fellow of MacDowell Colony and of the Independent Study Program of the Whitney American Museum of Art in Studio Practice and Cultural Studies. So she hold a Master of Architecture from Columbia University, a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science from the City University of New York. Yeah, please join me to welcome the Professor Yolande Daniel.
Okay, right. Thank you, Junho. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're very good.
Okay. I will be presenting research that's ongoing and that I received a research in architecture grant from USC, one of the first rounds of the grants that we got last spring. So that facilitated the research that I've been doing this summer and what I'll show you right now. And that research is ongoing throughout the fall. So I will share my screen. Okay, so the project which I'm working on is related to a body of research that I've been doing for some time. I actually worked on it while I was at the American Academy in Rome, and that was in 2003-04, and I exhibited the work at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and it was part of a show called Harlem World, Metaphors. I think it was something like Metropolis and Metaphors. Anyway, so I was working, the show was about gentrification, and I was looking at Harlem and kind of looking at how for Black communities, the kind of representation of Blackness is this thing that's overlaid over top of actual identities. And so I kind of started with looking at just Blackness in general. And here's a kind of definition. It's every definition I could find of Black. And in the definition, it basically includes extremes, like variations and extremes, and it contradicts itself, where Black can be all or nothing. It's an absorber, it's an emitter. It's kind of these very powerful opposites. And then when Black is attached to something like Black magic, blacklisted, blackballing, then it sort of modifies those terms. So from looking at Black and the way that it modifies the terms that it's attached to, I started to look at the city and the idea of the Black city, but also just how throughout this study is just how the term Black is overlaid on top of a people and all the associations that comes with that. Okay, so I'll be showing some clips initially from the first project, Black City, and this is a diagram that was very important in this project. It's a meta diagram, which basically explains the whole project, but in a very abstract way. And it kind of goes through, it's basically mapping out the structure, a structure of the city. And it includes policies, policies that are implicit and explicit, statistics that go from neighborhood, city, city, nation, nation, world, forms that have to do with the shape that cities take. So native has to do with urban sites in Chicago, Detroit, Miami, New Orleans, New York, and I looked at Los Angeles initially, and am looking at that again for this grant. And then spatial keys, which are a kind of smaller scale form, streets, ghetto, pens, projects. These are specific forms that are collapsed onto the idea of the Black city. And then diasporic forms, which have to do with capital and time. And then there were certain concepts that were coming up in my research, like race, minority, color line, black belt, white flight, which actually are inverse of each other, poverty line, upward mobility, glass ceiling. These are terms that were used to explain social phenomena. Dynamics, and the dynamics section has to do with, I guess in essence, how people get along and manage, and the terms that often they're opposites to, but terms like migrate, riot, mix or segregate, police, display. And I was looking at these terms, and the idea was that I would study the city and then I would try to make alternatives for the city. And that would be, and it could be as wild as I wanted it to be, because the city is actually kind of wild already. So for policy, this is just kind of mapping that out a little bit more, implicit and explicit laws, statistics with the 3 scales, the concepts. I was looking at census data and then kind of mapping populations from this. So all of this was put together in a model for a game. And basically what I'm mapping out here is the kind of field dynamics for that game. And here you're just seeing some of the clips from the film. So there's a thing about value that I was studying initially that had to do with, it was actually influenced by gentrification and real estate and the way that value could be flipped, so that something which was depreciated in value could be flipped and become something that was elevated in value and that you could actually make money off of if you were on the right side. And then within this field, there is a kind of battle going on between people who have the high ground or power and the people who don't, and then the kind of tactics that are used just to kind of survive. I guess some people might call it like a hustle. We talk a lot about side hustles now, but it's this idea of these actions that people who aren't empowered take to have a sense of power. So I did after I did this kind of video prototype, then I started looking at simpler options like board games and card games. And so this was a board game option looking at like flipping values on a field for the most part. And also thinking about like the different colors as like different resources and how you could get control of them. And so this is another version, again, looking at flipping value on a field, a game that I made using cards and a board. And then this was a study for it with like Legos and how this would work. And then kind of moving forward to this new body of research, so which very much extends what I was doing before. So this all came about because the Museum of Modern Art is doing a show called Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America. I might have the title a little bit wrong. And they invited 10 people to participate. Each was given a city. And then they also gave us scale and types and spaces that they wanted us to work with as a kind of curatorial framework. So I have the city Los Angeles. And I was really excited about working in Los Angeles, in part because I moved here last August, and then also because when I was doing research on the Black City previously, Los Angeles fell in a different bucket from the cities in the north and the cities in the south. And part of why that was is because it was becoming, and is now, part of a majority minority state. And so the kind of the dynamics of segregation and race mixing were different in Los Angeles. So this is kind of an opportunity to look at that. So basically, I proposed Black City, the Los Angeles edition, and it traces settlement patterns in the city, specifically Black settlement patterns in the city up to the present day through an interactive atlas. That's my goal and what I'm making. That consists of a glossary with dictionary plates, a timeline, two-dimensional maps, and a three-dimensional construct. So the Black City Dictionary describes words and phrases that have been used to define and prescribe Black communities since emancipation. The dictionary defines and identifies original sources from sociological texts to political brief, etc. As a whole, the dictionary outlines the past and present constraints of Black settlement and the limits of conceptions based on this foundation. So the idea from the Black City actually came as I was teaching a course, like a seminar on this subject, and from the research for the game, and how these terms, the concepts, how these concepts just kind of popped up, like terms like, that you use, black belt, white flight, upward mobility. Well, where did these terms come from? And actually they come from very specific like cultural phenomena, and the terms describe those. So black belt is like the consolidation of, actually black belt refers to the South and a particular time. And then white flight is kind of the suburban transition of whites leaving a city and then a companion to that is a consolidation of Blacks left in the city, which came to define the last half of the 20th century in America. And then that's shifted with what we call gentrification, another concept now. So in Los Angeles, I'm really interested in how, in terms of like value and resources, how the field is defined. There's this kind of way that people like to see Los Angeles, which is defined by, this is Rainer Banham's definition of freeway, foothills, plains, and shore. And each one of these has its own kind of mythology with it. But I wanted to get behind that and kind of look at these as basically environment and resources and control, like things that you control in the field. Housing is really important. So I had started mapping out just a general housing timeline in the Black City project. And that's something that I'm looking at specifically in Los Angeles. So the idea that there's de facto and de jure segregation. So like by law or not by law, but by custom, segregation is part of that study. And then the atlas is this idea of putting these parts together. Okay, so the Black City Dictionary was actually influenced by this urban dictionary by Susan Cahill and Michelle Cooper. And I had actually given as an assignment to students to make a Black dictionary. And I left it kind of open to them because they could look at any sort of, they didn't have to kind of look at it in terms of the city. So some looked at it in terms of music, some looked at it in terms of the city, but it was just, I left it open. Whenever I teach, I try to leave it open for students to enter with their interests. So this was from a book called The Urban Reader, which was from the 1970s. When I was doing this research initially, a lot of my resources came from the late 60s and 70s because that was sort of the last time people have been looking at this. However, that's changed recently. So now there's more recent scholarship about this topic. So here I have definition for urban. I was kind of interested in how urban becomes a kind of synonym for Black, or like a code word for Black in the way that it's used in the media. And looking at the definitions, you can see where it kind of through music starts to become a definition of music that's made in cities where people of African descent live and make the music, and then that starts to elide into a definition of like Blackness itself. Okay. So in the Black City, the Los Angeles edition, I'm actually making a more pointed version of the dictionary. So it's a glossary, which means I don't have to go from A to Z. And actually I'm using it as a way to narrate specific stories. So the stories, they're intended to kind of draw attention to the history of like African-American, not African-American, but people of African descent, of their settlement in Los Angeles from the founding by the Spanish in 1769 to the present day. So it's a kind of ambitious project, which won't all be done for this installation. So this is an excerpt from the glossary that I prepared for the catalog for the exhibition. And I don't think I can read all of these, but some of the terms that I have here will come back again. So one of them, there are a few stories in here. Azusa Street tells the story of William Seymour. Azusa Street is in Little Tokyo. of the preacher William Seymour, who in 1906 arrived in Los Angeles, and he established the Azusa Street Mission at 312 Azusa Street. And he started having hosting Azusa Street revival services, and they were 24 hours a day for an interracial immigrant congregation. And he had up to 1,500 worshipers at one point. And it basically, his movement is, many believe, the founding of the modern day Pentecostal movement. And it started at 312 Azusa Street in downtown Los Angeles. So basically the immigrants who were part of the congregation, as they kind of went back to their countries, they spread this religion, also within missions, spreading the religion. And it was started by a very humble Black minister who, and this is in 1906. So then the next story is Biddy Mason, a story that many people know about. What I was really interested in the story of Biddy Mason, what I was interested about was how she managed to do what she did. So Biddy Mason was enslaved when she came to Los Angeles. So her story is a story of one of the other definitions, free state, that while Los Angeles was a free state, there were slaves in it. People could bring their slaves and like live and work in Los Angeles with them. So she petitioned for freedom. I won't go into the story, but she won her freedom. But how she won her freedom actually had to do with other Blacks who were in San Bernardino County, where she was working with the family from Texas that brought her to Los Angeles. So in San Bernardino County, there were other Black families who were free, who actually enabled her and assisted her to get freedom. So I was really interested, not just in the single person, but in this community of people who were actively engaging the slave state and trying to help each other. So once she's free, she lives with one of the people who helped her, Robert Owens, who's actually a prominent Black businessman in Los Angeles. He and his wife took Biddy Mason's family in, and he was kind of a character. He's actually the last definition on this page, El Prieto, where there's a canyon in Altadena, which is named El Prieto, which is Spanish for the dark-skinned one, and it's named after Robert Owens, who, after he bought his freedom, settled there in the early 1850s, working to save up enough money to purchase his wife and children, which he did, and brought them to Los Angeles in 1852. And then he built a house, and he had property on San Pedro Street. His son married Biddy Mason's daughter, and is part of how he got involved with Biddy Mason and her bid for freedom. So following Robert Owens' example, Biddy Mason also invests in property downtown. So this family is like a power broker family, owning lots of properties in downtown throughout the city. And I kind of go into that in the project. So that's one of the stories. Azusa Street comes back because Biddy Mason actually, it's one of the properties that she owns, 312 Azusa Street, prior to William Seymour. And she donates it to the First African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was co-founded by herself and her son-in-law, Charles Owens, at this site. So there's this kind of overlap of the two stories at that property. Another story that I talk about is Calle de los Negros, which is, it was a kind of extension essentially of Los Angeles Street, probably predating Los Angeles Street, which was called Calle de los Negros by the Spanish, and then when the Anglo settlers came, it was referred to by the pejorative nigger alley. And no one really knows how it got its name, except for the fact that it was where Black and brown people lived. And it was also in this area, this part of downtown, which was right beside the Pueblo that the Spanish founded, which actually wasn't the original founding. It was like the fourth site that got moved after flooding. But anyway, that's where the Pueblo was located, and that ended up being a very mixed immigrant area. So downtown was very mixed and immigrant. It's where the railroads were being constructed from the founding in 1850 of Los Angeles as we know it, like through the late 1800s. So I will kind of go on. So that's like the glossary and the idea of the dictionary. And the dictionary plates basically picks up an exploration of these concepts that I was looking at initially, but in a different way. So race is one of the kind of meta concepts that I look at. And the most important thing here is that race is an obsolete term because genetic science basically proves that it's not an objective category any longer. It's a social category, but it's not a biological category, and it's tied into our conception of our cultural conceptions. It's so tied into our conceptions that we can't let go of it, but it's a fraught term. I won't talk about that. So ghost maps. This is one of the maps that we've produced for downtown, which basically shows the Mason block, which is the block for Biddy Mason, which is in her family, where they owned property that is most recognized, but they owned other property. So this is on Spring between 3rd and 4th. There's actually a monument by Dolores Hayden there. She's going to be coming to lecture behind the parking lot, which is where, parking structure, which is where her homestead used to be. And sorry, the next one is Calafia, and Calafia is an interesting one. I actually have different versions of this plate, but the image for this, what's collapsed on top of it, is Pico House. He was the last mayor of California when it was Mexican. He built this lavish hotel, Pico House, which he ended up being bankrupted and having to give back to the bank that was financing his lawsuits, because when California became a state, the Californios, the kind of mixed race Mexicans who lived here, they owned these ranches. They were like the original property owners. Part of the original agreement was that they could keep their property, but they were sued, and in fights between like legal battles, many of them ended up losing their property. So Pico House, he ended up losing it to the bank. There's on the right-hand side of this image, the little photograph part is a glimmer of Calle de los Negros. So it was right on the Pueblo. But basically, Calafia is the myth of, one of the myths of California. And it turns out that Calafia was actually a beautiful black Amazon from the gold-filled paradise island of California that was imagined in the 16th century romance novel by Garcia Ordonez Rodriguez de Montalvo. So basically, the name California comes from this novel about this paradise island that's guarded by these black Amazons, and Calafia is their queen. So I think I'll just go on from there. But there's another version of this plate that I'm working on, which is more about the myth of nature, like nature and bounty, and in California, as opposed to the Pueblo area. Zanza Madre. Zanza Madre was a kind of, what would you call it? It was a series of pipes underground that pumped water from the Los Angeles River to the downtown area. It was started, I believe, by the Spanish, and then expanded by the Mexicans, and then expanded by the Anglo settlers. And then it was deemed like not sufficient enough and forgotten until it was uncovered in metro construction. So one of the things that I'm getting at in this plate is the water, the kind of importance of water, the Zanza Madre underground, and the freeway. Places. This is a plate for the Mason block. So in each of the plates, I kind of go through the story in a little bit more depth that was in the glossary. And this is showing the properties first where Biddy Mason lived when she first lived with Robert Owens and his family, then when she kind of rented her first property, and then the two-story building that she built for her family and that she lived on the top floor of. And where, like, until her death, she founded a school and did these philanthropic works for the community. So the 19th century, the research that I've done so far, and we started in late July on the 20th century looking at Central Avenue. And basically what I'm showing you here is the way that we work. We're working from Sanborn maps. It's a little bit difficult right now because everything is online. And so we're basically piecing together the maps because that's how they are in the online resources, and then locating the properties that I'm researching on these maps. So that's an underlay. This is second, when the map kind of comes together more clearly as a structure. And then the next step for this is to kind of do the 2D, from the 2D, do the 3D projections to get a map similar to what I showed initially for the 19th century for downtown. Brick block. This is out of place, but Brick Block actually was a few blocks away from the Mason block, and it was a street of Black businesses. And one of the most famous ones was Blackburn's Coffee and Chop House. I haven't found any images of this chop house, but its location was noted on First between Los Angeles and like kind of on the corner of Los Angeles, I think between Los Angeles and San Pedro. And that street had quite a number of businesses on it. This is 20th century, Sugar Hill. So the story of Sugar Hill is actually a story of a freeway. The Sugar Hill cases were a series of restrictive covenant cases that the NAACP worked with residents to fight against when they were sued by the neighborhood association in this area. So the white neighbors formed a neighborhood association and sued the Black owners. The Black owners happened to be Hattie McDaniel from Gone with the Wind, and who's commemorated on in a star on Hollywood Boulevard, and some other like actresses and actors, and then lawyer, one of the people who bought property in this area, he bought the home and he waited something like 10 years before he even moved into it. Anyway, they won their case, and there were other cases like it that the NAACP kind of fought on behalf of Black residents who were trying to live in like better housing, and so they won their case. But then the freeway, which is kind of shown in this image, was run directly through their part of the West Adams neighborhood, and this part was called Sugar Hill, and after Harlem in New York. Yeah, and so the tenant organization didn't win, but in the end they actually won by putting the freeway through, because then that depreciated the value even for the Black tenants who were there. Not tenants, but homeowners. Another property that I'm looking at is the Dunbar Hotel. The Dunbar Hotel was built by a family, a husband and wife, who, Dunbar is the second kind of proprietor, but I can't remember their names right now, but they bought this property and they built a lavish hotel, and they housed the very first NAACP meeting in this hotel. And so what I was trying to show in this image, which is really hot off the presses, it's probably not quite finished, but was to kind of show how it has this very kind of 1950s lavish interior with like a central courtyard and a double height space in the inside. And I was trying to get at that in this image. But the idea that this Black couple would kind of, through their savings, they were both doctors, had this vision, built this building, and then around it, and this was on Central Avenue, around it, the community started to extend on Central Avenue and like consolidate. So what I'm doing with all of this, again, is putting it all together into, right now, into a kind of three-dimensional form, which would be this atlas. And the drawings and plates will all be installed in like on the wall in the museum. And then, yeah, the maps will have a three-dimensional component, which will be what the atlas is made out of that stands on the floor. So anyway, so we're working, we're still in the middle of this. So yeah, I hope it's not too confusing, but I welcome any questions that you have.
Okay, great. So yeah, if you have any question, yeah, please give a question directly to Professor Daniels.
I had a question. I did my hand up, but I guess that's not what you're doing. So I'll just ask it. Are you also looking at fiction or literature, or only at actual spaces and buildings?
So thank you, Diane. So in the past, I looked at literature. Like my focus was about, it was from representation, and it was very much about the idea of the Black body, Black space. And it was really, I looked at literature, and for this project, I really wanted to make it heavily architectural. So it's about place-based narratives. And I'm looking at multiple sources. They're not necessarily all historic, but for the most part, they are like historical narratives that I'm really like trying to find specific locations, the people associated with those locations, and to be able to locate them on a map and connect the dots between the spaces. I think I see what I'm doing. So when I say I want it to be architectural, is that throughout my work, I have resisted using images of people. I feel that, like as a student, I've sat through many lectures where I just saw images of Black people, but without any real exploration of what it meant to kind of have this image up. But the image was often a signifier for
Another.
For attention to a matter without attending to the matter. And so I've resisted images. So the Black City Project has no images of people. It's about what's behind the images of people. It's about what's kind of, what the dynamics of the structure are. And so in this project, what I wanted to do was make architecture the protagonist. So again, there aren't people. I do have images of them and stories about them, but I want to make it place-based. So every plate, when I first thought about the dictionary plates, which are actually modeled after prayer books, prayer plates from the medieval prayer books, which were like leaves of prayers, like with a saint on them and some kind of saintly happening. And when I was first thinking about how I could do this, I thought of Black saints, or I thought of Trayvon Martin. I thought of it could be George Floyd. I thought of people like that, but that's not my project. So my project then is finding the stories about Black settlement, about these struggles for Black settlement, and then that is what the plate becomes. So each plate is still a kind of prayer plate, but it's a prayer plate to Black settlement and like Black community, but not to a person.
And but you're only focused on downtown. You're not looking at the former jazz district that was cut up by the Century Freeway and stuff?
No, I started with downtown. So I basically overly ambitiously started with the beginning of Los Angeles. And then I became really interested in the 19th century. And so the research that's most complete was the 19th century. What we're working on now is the 20th century. The interesting thing about the 19th century is that the narrative is different from the 20th century. The 20th century is closer to us. That's a narrative that we're a little more familiar with. And so I'm working on that now. So the maps at the end, Central Avenue, Actually, it includes two stories, which I neglected to say. The upper part includes Bronzeville, which is like the 40s Little Tokyo again, where when the Japanese were interned and the white property owners needed to make money off of their properties, they rented to the African Americans who had come to work in the defense industry and basically pack them in into every space that they could in this area that became Bronzeville and was very, it was a jazz center in the 1940s. So that's in the downtown area in that time when the Japanese came back. Eventually the Blacks were removed or left, whatever. But moving down on Central, I didn't really talk about how the migration, which is something that the maps track, the migration from downtown towards Central and then down Central. That's what the map that I showed at the end, the long linear map, is about, that migration, with Bronzeville kind of at one end, downtown at one end, and the Dunbar Hotel at the other end. There are other maps to do, but this is an ongoing project, and I think I'll only get that far for this
Yeah,
For
the
the
only
winter.
Yeah, the only reason I was just going to make a suggestion, there is a work of fiction that's actually really quite interesting, and it takes place in about 1941, 42. It's Chester Himes, If He Hollers, Let Him Go. And I don't know, you're probably familiar with that.
I
And
know it, but I haven't read it. So I'll look at it.
the only reason is not so much to make, but it's actually somebody who lives in that kind of housing that you're just talking about, packed in all these defense workers, and who gets a car and gets, turned away basically when he tries to take his fiancée to dinner in downtown LA. But anyway, so it's useful not so much to be the basis of a project, but the kind of little detail that you can sort of add and flesh out without having to put people in the actual physical people in the images. And just a suggestion. Looks like a great.
That's a very good point. Thank you. I will. That's a really important point. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we have approximately 5 minutes left. Okay, so Mark, if you have question, yes, please do so.
Yeah. I actually wanted to say I've always enjoyed the Biddy Mason story and the Azusa Street story, but I never made a connection. So I've already benefited greatly from your work, Yolanda. I find it very interesting. In particular, I do find the Azusa Street phenomenon very interesting. It had a huge impact. It was the grain of something which grew to be worldwide. I'm delighted to find that we're looking at it. One of the things that I wondered about was, and I'm not sure how to phrase this question, so give me a little leeway. I see it as something that I think you talk about blackness here, and I see that one as something about blackness, but expanding in a lot of directions because, of course, it had an impact on just about every group there is. And in fact, it was one of the times where we managed to leap barriers in communities. I was wondering whether how that affects your study of that as a, I don't know, as a space or an event or a phenomenon.
Well, actually, so the way that I work with Blackness is that it's not only Black people. It's basically all minorities, or it's any person who's an outsider. So in my research generally, it's a broad term to include any number of others and kind of subordinate positions. But for this study, I wanted to, in Los Angeles, because it is, so it's very hard actually just to focus on Black settlement, because the ethnic groups and racial groups were kind of pushed together in the discrimination against them and their inability to move to other places. And so I could easily tell the story. So I mentioned, like with Calle de los Negros, the Chinese massacre in 1871. That area was a very immigrant heavy area. But what I'm interested in is how the history of Blacks is in these areas is not acknowledged. It's not acknowledged, and it doesn't stick. And so for that reason, I just want to focus on the Black settlement. I think maybe another generation of the project, I can expand it to expand on those other stories. And I'm trying to include them in, like, just a little bit, but not have it become the main thing.
Thanks.
Great. Okay.
Thank you.
So any other? Okay, Ginger. Yes, go ahead.
Is that okay? Thanks for the presentation. I was just wondering, especially after you mentioned the inspiration from these prayer books, about the role of religious institutions and practices and religious communities in this history, because it seems like it would have been part of it. I see it sort of popping up in certain places. But is that, but then it seems kind of missing in the mapping project and things like that. Is that a deliberate omission or?
Well, actually, the Azusa Street mission, I think I may have not shown that plate, but I have a plate for that, and I tell that story, which overlaps with the first African Methodist Episcopal Church story. And so that's where I go into, I don't go into a whole lot, but that's where I go into the aspect of the Black church. Like it overlaps with all the other stories that I'm telling for the 19th century.
I might have missed a little bit. I was sort of child caring and watching at the same time, so maybe I missed that part. Okay. But yeah, okay, that answers my question. I was just, because I must have missed that part of the presentation, but.
Okay, but I don't.
But does the actual prayer book itself, does that have a religious significance as a form, or is just kind of an interesting model for how to lay this out?
No, I actually see these, like when they're all done, each one is a kind of, it's a prayer leaf for, you know, for like a Black community that existed for however, you know, whatever length of time it existed, or it doesn't, and like to Mark's point, like with the Azusa Street mission, it's like if we didn't have like such a focus on race, then it wouldn't actually be necessary. But the idea, like with the Azusa Street mission, part of what was a problem with the mission was the fact that it had an interracial congregation.
If I could just say one other thing, and I know we have to leave, but it's interesting to me that you're also talking about the Black churches, because when I think about communities that have been, Black communities that have been destroyed, for example, in Cape Town, South Africa, in Houston, Freedmanstown, and so forth, these areas that have been essentially taken over, the thing that survives is the Black church, which is to me really interesting. Even in South Africa, in Cape Town, where the removals took place in the 60s and early 70s, those churches are still there, and the people from the flats still come and attend church in those old churches. So it's really interesting to me that this is also happening, or happens in Los Angeles, the significance of the churches. So just a side point.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely the churches as a power structure are very important. Yeah. Sorry.
Is there any other question? Okay, so if there is not, yeah, before we closing, yeah, I have one fundamental, very general question. So in Los Angeles, I have found that we have many resources available for research and also teaching. So in my case also, I try to accommodate some industry resources and or some city resources to integrate with my research component. So I'd like to ask you if there is any specific resources that you may be interested, and also you think that we need to access and accommodate for enhancing our research function. So especially about African American architecture and community. So if you have any place or resource that you want to recommend to accommodate for us, yeah, please.
Is that,
yeah, please suggest some. Yeah.
Is that for question for everyone, or?
No, it's for you. Yeah.
Oh, for me. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, am I to answer it now or later?
Yeah, you can email me all the time, but for general purpose.
I mean, just I think in doing this work that the resources in the USC library, like regarding African American history, they could be stronger. I think they should be stronger. Yeah, like there are certain books that I I'm researching and I'm looking for them in the library, and I got the Sanborn maps from the library, and there are things I can get from the library. Like for Central Avenue, for example, I was able to get a book on music history, but not any of the other books on Central Avenue from the library. And I think it's really lacking in, especially where it is in South Central, like in these historical resources.
I see. Okay, great. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your fantastic presentations. These are really informative and very, very effective for us to learn in a short time frame. Okay, so why don't you give her a big hand? Even though.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for your presentation again. So for everybody, so actually today's lecture, Yolande's talk, it will be available soon on our school website. So actually our current master is currently working on some research menu, so research tab in our main web page. So you can access the research website of our School of Architecture, and then you can find the listed links that you can review the presentation again. Okay. Yeah. Before we closing, actually, I have a couple of announcements. So the research seminar, the schedule will be changed from the next one. So yeah, today is Wednesday, but because I have found some critical schedule conflict in school level, so we will have a second research seminar at 12 p.m. on September 21st on Monday. So yeah, it means that our other research seminar will be held on Monday bi-weekly. And second thing is that, yes, it is at all talks and seminar. And also we will have a research workshop next semester. So all some presentation at our research program will be posted by recording, okay? And third one, we will have the next speaker in 2 weeks. We will have Mr. David Schwartz at the HLW. So he will talk about Project Hero, which is based on the collaborationship between HLW and USC Architecture and USC Keck Medicine. So actually the project is about architecture, design, and science in COVID-19 environment. So I know he's always looking for some part-time and a full-time worker from USC student group. So for his second research phase. So I hope many students would be interested and also attend next seminar. Okay, thank you very much for everybody, and especially for your during this suffering period. So I hope you stay healthy and also stay happy. Thank you very much. Okay, bye.